Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister at the University of Toledo.
Many women didn't want to talk about differences, women especially in the feminist movement, because they were always interpreted as somehow indicating inferiority. So that people were saying, well, women are different, they're not as logical. And that would end up being a put-down. And so that many women didn't want that put-down, were looking for greater equality. And so the big line seemed to me to be, let's blur the differences. Let's somehow say that we're all together in all of this.
Joining Father Bacik in today's Reflections is Dr. Elizabeth Rice Allgaier, an assistant professor of psychology at Bowling Green State University. Today's Reflections focuses on the topic of psychological differences between men and women. Here's Father Bacik.
Betsy, since you are a recognized expert in the whole field of human sexuality, I would like to discuss that with you a bit and direct our attention especially to the question of differences between men and women, psychological kinds of differences. Now, my own perception of that is that for a number of years now in liberal circles, it has been not too much in to talk along that line. I remember one time I was talking to a well-known woman theologian and brought up the question of whether there weren't certain religious differences based on different male and female psychology and so on. And her response was something like to say, well, that's a bunch of baloney, that there really isn't anything to that. And my sense was that many women didn't want to talk about differences, women especially in the feminist movement, because they were always interpreted as somehow indicating inferiority. So that people were saying, well, women are different, they're not as logical. And that would end up being a put-down. And so that many women didn't want that put-down, were looking for greater equality. And so the big line seemed to me to be, let's blur the differences. Let's somehow say that we're all together in all of this.
Yeah, there has been a very strong movement toward repression of any information that related to differences between men and women. The fear being in some circles that that information would be used politically to keep women from political office, employment advancement, and that kind of thing. It's been very interesting just recently watching the publicity accompanying the research on premenstrual stress syndrome, with many feminists concerned that if there is much focus placed on that kind of thing, that it will be used as justification for keeping women in second-class status. I would say that within the university community, those people who are concerned with getting as much information as they can about human beings in general, and men and women in particular, there is less of a tendency to be concerned with what is found. We want to know how we're similar and how we're different.
That was an interesting point that you made, that the fear really is a political, social kind of one. In other words, if it was said that women were bothered in the premenstrual situation, that they couldn't make good decisions, therefore we couldn't let them in high office or something like that.
Yes.
Okay, my other sense of this situation is that this is reversing a little bit. As I read the book reviews, I see that people are beginning to be willing to talk more about this. I'm thinking back to that book, wasn't it Unfinished Business by Maggie Scarf? I think that I saw a lot of reviews and where she was willing to talk about this question again of differences between men and women. And there's a recent book that I saw reviewed called In a Different Voice by Carol Gilligan. I haven't read the book, but again, the reviews look very interesting, and especially when they're reviewed by obvious feminists favorably. In other words, it's like saying, okay, let's introduce this again. Let's move to a new stage of this whole feminist movement where we can begin to talk about this matter. And as you said, in university circles, that people have seen the need to do this. After all, we have to continue to explore this, and if there is a truth here, and if there's something important in there, and if there are indeed differences, we ought to know them and be able to deal constructively with them.
Yeah, I think the thing that is most important to realize is that almost all characteristics of men and of women exist on overlapping dimensions, which means that although the average man may be more aggressive excuse me, than the average woman, that there are some women who are more aggressive than the average man. And the same thing is true of nurturance and of any other quality that we associate with one gender or the other. Very interesting that a woman named Sarah Hrdy, who wrote a book called The Woman That Never Evolved, and that grammatical error there is in the title, not. The book itself is a fascinating book, but her first chapter is most interesting because she talks about the amount of resistance she has gotten from women scientists to the notion that there might be differences between men and women. She's describing all of this from a sociobiological standpoint. And of course, that's an anathema to feminists as well.
Okay, Betsy, let's start to look a bit at the question of the differences. Let's explore this, and because I think it really is important for us getting along as men and women, for family relationships, for our culture as a whole to bring this out and to be able to deal with it. My first sense is that as human beings, there's a commonness about us. That's the first thing that I always want to say, that we all are human beings who question. We wonder what it's all about and where we fit into the total scheme of things. And we're people who love, who are loved, who fall in love, who have love for other people. That's common. We're all people who are born and have to face death someday. And so that seems to me to link us together in bonds that are so important and really unbreakable in a way. And it gives a commonness to the human situation. I think it's what allows us to talk with one another and to feel sure that somehow we have some common meanings as we try to interact. And I think if we say that first, we're more at ease in talking about what I think are some of the differences then. I don't know if much of the literature proceeds that way, really. Maybe that's more the kind of a statement that a theologian or a philosopher would make rather than the people doing the research in the sexual area. But to me, that's really important to set that framework. In a Christian framework, I would say we're all sons and daughters of the one Father, and we're all traveling the same path. And those who come at it from a more secular viewpoint are able to say, yes, we are asking the same questions, and we are facing many of the same experiences. So maybe we have that framework in mind, and it makes us a little easier to go forward with looking at the differences. That makes sense to you as a starting point?
Yeah, and I would say also that people doing research in the area do the same thing. They start out by pointing out that we are, first of all, human beings, and that there are really relatively few differences between us as a function of gender, but let's look at this particular difference which we find.
Okay. All right, let me take a stab at this then and look at what might be a fundamental difference here, as I would see it out of my own experience, and I see it corroborated in some of the literature these days, and that is that men in our culture at least have the fundamental need to achieve, to accomplish, to do something, to make something, to achieve success in their life, and therefore that the great danger that men feel, or the great challenge, is failure. That I won't measure up somehow, I won't achieve, I won't accomplish, I won't be looked up to as someone who really managed his life and did something worthwhile. And on the other hand, I would see the great need for women in our culture again to achieve bondedness, to have connections, to achieve relationships, intimacy. And here the great fear is of aloneness, that I won't achieve that somehow I will be by myself too much. I can just remember phone calls in the night coming to me as a counselor from women saying, you know, I just can't stand to be alone anymore. You know, they ring in my ears, really plaintive calls of this aloneness being such a terrible problem. Now, as I say all of that, I'm reminded of what you said earlier, that there are overlaps here, obviously, and I think that there would be some men listening to what I'm saying here and say, well, I'm not all that achievement-oriented. I'm into relationships, intimacy. I hate loneliness. And I'm sure there's some women listening who say, you know, I got my career and I want to accomplish it. I really don't need any close relationships right now. But I guess my point would be that statistically we're going to find more men functioning out of this achievement model and more women functioning out of this relationship model.
Yeah, I would like to point out that you used the term achievement while you were talking about both men and women. There's a very famous study that was done in 1973 which showed that the levels of desire to achieve were very similar between men and women. You couldn't find a difference in terms of the desire to achieve per se, but that what it was that was sought by the average woman was different from what was sought by the average man. So that both want to achieve, but men tend to want to achieve more in the outside world, and women may want to achieve more in terms of raising children in a particular way or keeping a house at a particular level of neatness. The concept of androgyny then becomes very important in terms of those individuals you were describing who say, well, they don't, they're into relationships, their need to achieve is not that high among men, or with women who are concerned with a career and say they're not that much into relationships. And the androgyny concept here would refer to those people who say, yeah, I really love doing well professionally in my career or whatever, and I love having someone with whom I share that, my partner. I want both things. And Jung, years ago, suggested that when we begin to reach middle age, the 40s, that we may begin to be able to meet both kinds of things that are characteristic, that are trained into men in a culture, and things that are trained into to women. We may be able to integrate those into our personalities so that we're doing both kinds of things.
Yeah, raising Carl Jung's name there seems helpful to me. That his concept of the anima in the male,
Yes.
and which meant that inside of the man there is this female pole or these feminine characteristics. And one of his criticisms of our culture was that men could not show those emotions in any way. The need to cry, for example, or the men felt the need to be strong and not cry and to not show softer, more tender kinds of qualities. And Jung was saying that that really stultified men, and that a full, mature man would be able to integrate the anima, or the feminine pole, within the total personality. And I think that it does seem helpful here, so that we don't end up making tight stereotypes. I think what we're talking here, and in the whole conversation, we have to remember that idea of ideal types, that no one fits them exactly. They are generalizations used for the purpose of analysis or discussion, and to direct our attention to the particular areas that may well be investigated. But no individual fits them exactly. When I'm going to the idea of aloneness, Betsy, with women and so on, I wonder how you resonate with that. I mean, do you think in some ways, again, according to our ideal type idea and so on, that is a greater problem for women than men in the culture?
In the culture, yes, because if you raise half of your human beings to believe that the only way that they can be validated is through somebody else's approval, directly all the time, to be good girls, and later good women, good wives, good mothers, then they are looking externally for validation rather than being able to validate themselves through their own pride in what they may do, think, feel, etc. I don't think that is, well, there's no evidence to suggest that is inherently a part of being a female, that it goes with estrogen, progesterone, breasts, etc., but that rather it's something that we've done by way of training, and that can be as stultifying to deal with another human being who is constantly seeking approval from you and validation from you, can be very stultifying to both the person who's seeking the approval and the person from whom the approval is sought.
In my own counseling, I've often felt that really is a key problem. I've often said that if women could have status and security on their own in our culture, we would be far better off, that the culture would run better. And I'm inclined to agree with you that this is a matter of culture and of training, that women are sort of taught somehow that their only satisfaction can come from pleasing a man. Their only happiness can come from having a man. In other words, one's whole life seems as though it's dependent on a man. And I've counseled a number of women in just trying to break them out of that stereotype or that cultural myth, and often very unsuccessfully. It is so ingrained that people just think that that's the way it is. I can't help that.
Yeah, you're trying to do in a few hours, let's say, you're trying to have an impact on a message that has been given to many women from the time they were very tiny, little girls, that their role in life is to please others, and it's very hard to undo the effect of that training in the space of a few hours that you might spend in counseling.
I was reminded of an article that Ellen Goodman did not long ago talking about male-female differences, and in the column she was saying the man asked the woman, where do you want to go to eat? You know, it's your choice tonight. And in her mind, all kind of things are going on like, well, what's he want? You know, where does he want to go? And did he have a good time when we went here last time? And so that what he's after is a decision. He just wants to know where they're going. And he's getting more impatient as she vacillates or asks these questions. What are you in a mood for tonight? Or what kind of food do you want? Or do you like this place? All he wants is a decision. He wants it in her hands. And what she wants, as Ellen said, is consensus. She wants to feel as though we've arrived at this together. And that to have that kind of satisfaction in knowing that it's a joint decision, and that indeed he's going to be happy when they get there. And this, of course, creates all kind of problems. He's getting more impatient while she's trying to make this decision, and she's getting frustrated because she wants him to be pleased in how things work out.
It's a tremendous burden to always have to be the one who makes decisions, who decides where you're going to go and who decides what the activities are going to be. And it's fun sometimes to be the one who goes along on somebody else's adventure rather than being always the one who sets up the adventure.
Yeah, I get you're suggesting that very often, in other words, men would feel good to have the women make the decisions like that sometimes.
That's what the research indicates, that they would like women to be more active, to take more responsibility, that they don't want always to be the father or the boss or whatever, but rather to be the companion. And when you're companions, sometimes one person has a good idea and energy to do something, and sometimes the other one does. But it can be a burden if it's always placed on one person, in this case the man.
Yes. Betsy, I'm reminded of this review I was reading of this book by Carol Gilligan called In a Different Voice, and it was based on moral decision-making. And the idea was that in Kohlberg's research, which so many people use, the stages of moral development, that Kohlberg really analyzed boys and men as he went along in his studies, and that the women came out in his scale usually fixated at the third level, the level of trying to please and help others, and therefore they were seen as being sort of morally underdeveloped, and not the high-ranking morality, the stage 6, which works on universal principles and so on. And this book, I think, is trying to overturn that and say, no, it's not that simple, really, that there's not one better way than the other, but indeed there are really differences. That's what this research evidently indicates, that they're different but not inferior. And she uses an interesting technique. She showed pictures to men and women in which people were at various times very close together or very far apart, and then they were to tell stories about it. And as the figures in the picture came closer together, men's stories had more images of violence in them. And as the figures were further apart, women's stories had more images of violence. And her conclusion really is, from all of that, that men's problem is closeness, that they fear intimacy in a way, that the closeness is what bothers them, and where the women again fear the aloneness or the separateness or the distance between people, and that's when they draw in their figures of violence. That's interesting, isn't it?
That's fascinating. It's very interesting. She's done some other research looking at Kohlbergian type stages as far as abortion decisions are concerned, and I'm familiar with her work in that context. I've not read this book, but the research on nonverbal behavior and on intimacy with men and women shows that women are much more likely to touch one another and are much more comfortable with touch than men are. Men avoid touching, and it fits very much in with what she's finding. That's very interesting. I'd like to read that book.
When you were saying that, I was thinking in Europe you often see mother and daughter walking down the street hand in hand, holding hands. Very common sight.
And you see the same thing among men in the Middle East, and you see kissing and so forth. And I think, again, that underlines the notion of the cultural differences rather than something inherent about being a male that would make you resist contact with other human beings.
Again, you like to emphasize that, don't you? And I think that most of the feminists do, that I read, say the differences are often cultural.
Yeah,
and that therefore that it's possible to change them or to alter our patterns.
Well, I think this all gets very complicated. First of all, I would describe myself as a psychologist, which is a disciplinary area, rather than a feminist, which is a political point of view. Here, I am functioning as a psychologist.
Yes.
First of all. The second thing is that we sometimes get confused about the meaning of biological differences, even when they occur. Again, most differences that are biologically based exist on an overlapping distribution. And to assume that because something is biologically based, when it, if in fact something is found to be biologically based, that it's immutable or unchangeable is not an accurate description of what exists. We have very, very few absolute differences that exist between men and women. And I think when you look at our culture, which very much has emphasized self-sufficiency, self-reliance and so forth in terms of the training for men, you see a lot of the bases for teaching men not to allow themselves to get too close to others, not to be expressive of emotion or to be tender, because that may reduce the extent to which they can go out and win the West, or whatever the myth happens to be that leads them or leads socialization agents to emphasize self-reliance so much in men.
If we were to take the premises that I think we're agreeing on here, it would suggest certain things that we need to do. One is men would have to be more expressive in our culture, more willing to share their emotions, to enter into intimate relationships, willing to talk at a deeper level with women, and surely I see that in my marriage counseling. So often that's the case. If I'm sitting there and someone is telling me that that my partner doesn't talk much or doesn't share feelings, it's almost always the man that's being discussed. It's the husband who's not doing those things. It would certainly seem to be a step forward, both personally and culturally, if men were more in touch with our deeper feelings and able to express them more. I think we would do better. And I think on the same side, if we take the premises again, that women are going to be better off when they overcome some of these problems of aloneness, when they feel secure within themselves and are able to sense that they are worthwhile on their own. I often told the young women in the university setting that I think we would make great steps forward if women were able to say no to men sexually. They just felt that freedom, that it wasn't going to be, they would lose the man or never have another date or never find a husband. If they could just have that sense of security in themselves, that they were all right, they could have a happy and fulfilled life. If marriage came, fine, but if not, okay, I can live with that. And I think we would move far forward if both the men and the women could deal better with those fundamental differences that we've been discussing.
Yeah, there was an interesting study done a few years ago looking at this whole issue of expressiveness and physiological changes going on. And what the gist of the study was that they found that women were more expressive of whatever their emotions were. They were being shown different kinds of photographs of atrocities and erotic drawings and one thing and another, but women's faces were more communicative. They were more expressive of whatever it was they were viewing than men were. Ironically, what they found, however, was that when you did physiological measures of heart rate and so forth, of what was going on within the body, men, apparently by virtue of not expressing what it was they were feeling, were reacting much more strongly physiologically. And then when you think about all of the differences that we have with respect to heart attack, stroke, the kinds of stress diseases that kill men in far greater numbers than they kill women, and you look at that difference in terms of the expression of the emotion and the energy, you can see that men would have a great deal to gain by being able to express what's going on them, put it out of themselves a little bit more.
That's a fascinating thing that you said. The heart rate would be different, but the face wouldn't show it.
Basic poker face. Yeah.
That's interesting.
They
I think,
keep it
again,
inside.
very often we men are taught that in the culture to be like that. I'm thinking of something else here, the difference that I observed in games being played by youngsters when I was teaching in a high school. If I would take the boys up to the gym to play basketball, give them the ball and they would play, and the rules of the game would be established. You fouled me, that's it, take it out. It all worked rather smoothly. I remember taking a group of young women up, high school students, doing the same thing, and it just wouldn't work. I mean, they had a big argument about what was going on. I've seen research which suggests that girls would rather stop the game than really resolve the dispute, and that the rules weren't so much. What they were interested in is hurting people least. That was sort of the dominant motive in how the game would run. And again, I think that shows us that at an early age there really are cultural differences and sort of programmed into young boys and girls.
Well, boys being more goal or task oriented, and girls being more process oriented. Yeah.
Yes. Again, the consensus that they want. They wanted the consensus, and rather quit the game, stop the game, than fight their way through all of those particular battles. Well, Betsy, we've been talking a lot about differences. I mean, we could raise other things, couldn't we, about that whole achievement motivation, the problem of women's fear of success. I know there's a lot of debate on that, whether that's really true or not, whether they have that fear. But I've certainly run into women who say that they're not going to do something because they're afraid their boyfriend won't like it or they'll outshine him. I remember playing golf one time with a Jewish woman and her husband, and in between she was asking me, do you think I should beat him today or not? And I think it sort of represented that. So there's all kinds of differences here, and I think we have a lot of fundamental agreement on this, and it looks to me like once we're in touch with those, we really could function better. We men could be more in touch with our emotions, and maybe you women can feel greater status and security within yourselves, and then we'll move closer to a culture that indeed functions in a holistic way.
You've been listening to Reflections with your host, theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister at the University of Toledo. Joining Father Bacik in this discussion was Dr. Elizabeth Rice Allgaier, assistant professor of psychology at Bowling Green State University. The topic of this week's Reflections was psychological differences between men and women. If you have any questions about today's program or any ideas for topics you'd like to hear discussed, please write to Reflections in care of WLQR, Toledo, Ohio, 43623. Produced in the studios of WLQR, Reflections is directed by Mary Beth Kirchner. Reflections is brought to you by the Genesis Radio Network.